The night my brother announced his engagement at our family's 4th of July party, my father pulled me aside and said, "Try not to embarrass us this year, Sloan." He didn't even look at me when he said it, just adjusted his cufflinks and walked back toward the tent, where 200 guests were sipping champagne under Edison lights. I stood there for a moment, holding a glass of sparkling water, watching him go. In my bag, tucked between my phone and my keys, was a letter from my CFO confirming that our Series C had just closed at $400 million. Our company's valuation had crossed $2 billion the week before. I hadn't told anyone in my family. I wasn't ready. Or maybe I just needed to see, one more time, exactly what they thought of me when they had no reason to pretend otherwise. That's the thing about being the quiet one. People forget you're listening. Growing up, I was always the wrong kind of daughter. My brother Tate was the golden one. First in his class at Vanderbilt, recruited straight into finance. The kind of son my father introduced at parties with both hands on his shoulders like he was presenting a trophy. My mother curated her life like a magazine spread, and Tate fit perfectly into every page. I never did. I was too interested in things nobody understood yet. I spent high school building apps in my bedroom instead of going to homecoming. I got into MIT on a full scholarship, and my father's response was, "I hope you're not planning to be one of those people who thinks a degree is a personality." I wasn't planning anything except survival. The year I graduated, I moved to Austin with $11,000 in savings and an idea I'd been refining for 3 years. A logistics software platform designed specifically for small independent retailers, the kind of businesses that were getting crushed by larger competitors, not because their products were worse, but because their supply chains were chaotic. I'd watched my aunt run a boutique children's clothing store for 20 years, and I'd seen exactly where the cracks were. I built something to fill them. The first 2 years were brutal in the way that nobody warns you about. Not the dramatic kind of brutal, not the movie version where you sleep on a friend's couch and eat ramen and then suddenly everything clicks. The real kind. The kind where you work until 2 in the morning and wake up at 6 and spend most of the day in a state of low-grade terror that you're making a catastrophic mistake. I lived in a one-bedroom apartment with a broken dishwasher and a landlord who called me sweetie, even after I'd asked him 3 times not to. I ate a lot of salads from the grocery store hot bar because they were the cheapest warm food I could find. My family knew I'd started something. They just didn't take it seriously. My mother called it your little project. My father asked twice if I'd consider going back to school for an MBA so I could do something real with that brain. Tate, who by then had married a woman named Courtney whose family had more money than most small countries, simply never asked about it at all. To them, I was the eccentric youngest child who had opted out of the right life. They were patient with me the way people are patient with someone they've decided is lost. I did not tell them when we hit our first million in annual recurring revenue. I didn't tell them when we expanded to 8 employees, then 20, then 60. I didn't tell them when we signed our first Fortune 500 partnership or when Axios ran a piece about us that called me one of the most quietly influential founders in enterprise software. I kept my professional life entirely separate from my family life, and my family, absorbed in their own world, didn't notice the distance. The only person in my family who ever asked real questions was my grandmother on my mother's side, a woman named Edna who had run a hardware store in rural Tennessee for 40 years and retired at 82 because, as she put it, I got tired, not broke. She called me every Sunday. She didn't pretend to understand software, but she understood hustle, and she understood the specific exhaustion of building something while the people around you looked the other way. She never missed a Sunday until last spring when she passed in her sleep at 87. I flew home for her funeral and came back to Austin and cried in my car for an hour before I could make myself go inside. She was the only one who knew about the company. The real version, not the edited one I offered my parents when forced. I told her everything, the investors, the growth numbers, the sleepless nights, the moment I realized we were actually going to make it. She'd listened to all of it with the kind of attention that makes you feel seen in a way you didn't know you'd been missing. After she died, I went quieter with my family than ever. So there I was at Tate's engagement party in late June, standing on the manicured back lawn of my parents' home in Nashville, watching my father welcome guests I'd never met while a string quartet played something I didn't recognize. Tate's fiancée, a woman named Portia, whose parents were there too. looming over the party in that particular way of wealthy people who know exactly how much everything costs, had already greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes and a comment about how fun it was that I did tech stuff. My father's partner in his law firm, a man named Stuart, who I'd known since I was 12, found me by the appetizer table and asked what I was up to these days. When I told him I ran a software company, he nodded slowly in the way people do when they're trying to decide if something counts. Startup thing? He asked. I said yes. He said, well, good for you, and turned to flag down a passing server. Dinner was under the tent. White linen, candlelight, hydrangeas. My mother had outdone herself. I was seated at a side table with two of Tate's college friends and their wives, which told me everything I needed to know about where I ranked in the evening's hierarchy. Tate and Portia were at the center table with both sets of parents, and I could hear my father's laugh carrying across the tent in the practiced way of a man who had spent 40 years making rooms feel comfortable for people he wanted to impress. Portia's father, a man named Dex who had the handshake of someone who'd taken a course on firm handshakes, gave a toast early in the evening that included a long passage about legacy and the importance of marrying into ambition. He looked at my father warmly when he said it. My father raised his glass. My mother smoothed the front of her dress. Later, Tate found me near the bar. He looked happy in the slightly distracted way of someone who has been performing happiness for 4 hours. You good? He asked. I said yes. He said, Dad was asking if you're still doing the startup thing. I said I was. He said, cool, and then Portia appeared at his elbow and pulled him back toward a cluster of people I didn't know, and that was the whole conversation. It was Portia's mother who finally said the thing that everyone else had been circling. She came to stand beside me near the dessert table. A woman named Claudette, who wore her money the way some people wear perfume, everywhere and without restraint, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as charitable. It must be hard, she said, being the only one who didn't quite land somewhere. She said it kindly. That was the worst part. She meant it as comfort. I smiled at her. I said, I think I landed exactly where I meant to. She laughed softly, like I'd said something sweet and slightly naive, and moved on. I drove home that night 2 hours through summer dark and thought about Edna the whole way. I want to tell you that I didn't care. I want to say I was above it, that years of building something real had insulated me from the small cruelties of people who had decided what I was worth before I had a chance to show them. But that's not true. I cared. I sat with that caring for about a week, turning it over, feeling the specific burn of being looked through by the people who were supposed to know you best. And then I did what I always do with feelings I can't afford to get lost in. I converted them into work. We had been in quiet talks with 2 potential acquirers for about 4 months. One was a large enterprise software company based in Seattle. The other was a logistics conglomerate that had been watching us for 2 years and finally gotten serious. I'd always been clear with my board that I wasn't interested in selling too early, but both offers had come in over $1.5 billion, and my investors were patient but not infinitely so. By September, I had made my decision. I'm not going to pretend the number didn't matter to me. Of course it did. But what mattered more was what the acquiring company planned to do with what we built. After 3 months of negotiations, we agreed to terms that protected our team, preserved our product roadmap, and gave me an ongoing role as Chief Strategy Officer for the combined entity. My personal stake in the deal, after everything cleared, came out to just over $220 million. I was 31 years old. I didn't tell my family. I told my lawyer. I told my CFO, who cried a little and then apologized for crying and then cried again. I told one friend, a woman named Bex, who had known me since college and who responded by driving to my apartment with a bottle of champagne she could not afford and proceeding to drink most of it herself while telling me in increasing detail what she planned to do when I inevitably made her a millionaire. I did not call my parents. I did not call Tate. I told no one in my family anything. The acquisition announcement went out in October through the normal channels, a press release, a few trade publications. A brief piece in the Wall Street Journal that described me as the founder whose quiet exit just reset the benchmark for mid-market software valuations. My mother texted me a link to the article with a question mark. That was it. No call. A question mark. My father's paralegal, apparently, saw the article first. According to my mother, he had walked into my father's office and set his phone on the desk without saying anything, and my father had read the piece 3 times before he fully understood what he was looking at. He called me that evening. I let it go to voicemail. He called again. I answered the second time because I was curious what he would lead with. The Wall Street Journal, he said. Not hello, just that. I said yes. He was quiet for a moment. Then, why didn't you tell us? I thought about how to answer that honestly. I thought about the engagement party, and Stuart's polite dismissal, and Claudette's gentle condescension, and the years of your little project and try not to embarrass us, and the Sunday calls with Edna that had been the only place I ever felt like my work was real to anyone who shared my blood. I said, I wanted to see what everyone thought of me first. Another silence. That's not fair, he said. No, I agreed. It wasn't. He didn't have anything to add to that. We talked for about 15 minutes, mostly him asking logistics questions about the deal, which was the only way he knew how to show that something mattered. And then we said goodbye, and I sat in my apartment for a long time with the lights off, feeling something I couldn't immediately name. Not triumph, not satisfaction. Something quieter and more complicated than either of those things. Tate texted me the next morning. It said, "Heard from Dad. Congrats. That's a big deal." A pause, and then, "I didn't know you were that far along." Another pause. I guess I should have asked more. I appreciated the last part. It was more than I expected. Portia's mother called my mother, apparently, which I found out about later. My mother relayed this to me as a piece of social information rather than an emotional one. The way she always processes things, but underneath the reporting, I could hear something that might have been pride, or might have been relief, or might have been relief. Claudette said she had no idea you were so accomplished, my mother told me. I told her you never really talked about it. I said, I know. There was a pause. I should have asked more too, my mother said. She said it like it was a fact she was stating, not an apology she was offering, which was the most honest version of an apology I had ever heard from her. My father flew to Austin in November. He didn't announce it in advance. He called me from the airport, which was very him. That particular brand of confidence that assumes you will simply rearrange yourself. I thought about telling him I was busy. I wasn't busy. I drove to the airport. We had dinner at a place near my apartment that he would never have chosen if he'd been in charge. A small Vietnamese restaurant with paper menus and no reservations, and the best pho I had found in 3 years of looking. He sat across from me and looked slightly uncomfortable with the laminate table and slightly more uncomfortable with everything else. And we ordered, and then he looked at me with an expression I had never quite seen on him before. "Tell me about it," he said. "The whole thing, from the beginning." So I did. I told him about Edna's store, and the gap I'd seen, and the $11,000, and the broken dishwasher, and the 2 years of low-grade terror, and the first enterprise client, and the scaling problems, and the moment I knew we were actually going to work. I told him about the acquisition conversations, and why I'd chosen the offer I chose, and what I hoped would happen to the product, and what my role was going forward. I talked for a long time. He listened without interrupting, which was not something I associated with him. When I finished, he said, "Your grandmother talked about you every time I saw her. She always said you were going to do something the rest of us couldn't see yet." I didn't say anything for a moment. "She didn't tell me any of this," he said, "but she was very certain about you." I looked down at my soup. I thought about Edna on the phone on Sundays, asking the right questions, and how she had never once told me to manage my parents' expectations or be more realistic or find something with a clearer path. She had just listened and asked more and said, at the end of every call, "Keep going." "I miss her," I said. "I know," he said. "Me too." We sat in silence for a while. It was the most comfortable silence I could remember having with my father since I was maybe 9 years old. He picked up the check. I didn't argue. Then he said, "I owe you more than that," and I understood he didn't mean the dinner. I said, "You can start with questions, real ones. When something's going on in my life, ask what it actually is, not whether it counts." He looked at me for a moment. "That's fair," he said. It wasn't a transformation. I want to be clear about that, because I think stories like this are supposed to end with transformations, with fathers who suddenly see the light, and mothers who weep, and brothers who call to say they had it wrong. Real life doesn't move that cleanly. What I got was something smaller and more durable. A beginning of a different kind of conversation with people who had spent a long time talking past me. Tate called me in December, the week before Christmas. He said Portia had been asking about me, genuinely, after reading more about the company. He said, she actually works in supply chain consulting. I don't know why we never talked about this. I laughed, because of course. Of course she did. He said, can I come visit? Austin, I mean. I want to see where you work. I said yes. My grandmother's hardware store is still open, run now by one of her longtime employees who bought it from the estate. I drove past it on my way through Tennessee in early November, a week before my father's visit. It looked exactly the same green awning, same hand-lettered hours on the door, same parking lot with the cracked corner she always said she'd get fixed someday. I sat in the car for a few minutes and thought about all the Sunday phone calls and how she had been, without making any fuss about it, the first investor I ever had. Not in money, but in the thing that mattered more, which was belief. I have a foundation now. It's small, still getting started. We fund women, building companies in industries where the infrastructure has always been built for someone else. When I was putting together the application criteria, I wrote one line that I keep coming back to. We are especially interested in founders whose families did not see them coming. That line is not about bitterness. I want to be clear about that too. It's about the specific kind of clarity that comes from building in the absence of expectation. When no one is watching, when no one thinks you'll succeed. When the space around you is empty of approval, that's when you find out what you actually believe in. That's when you find out who you are. I found out. It took a broken dishwasher and 5 years and $11,000 and one grandmother who called me every Sunday without fail. That was enough. It turned out to be more than enough.